Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here once again. Thank you for joining us on our Connecting Conversations with Cohesia Connect. I'm Carla, and this is Avelka. We are the co-founders of Cohesia Connect, and we're so delighted to be sharing our platform today with the one and only Buki Mosaku. Buki, welcome. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, first of all, thanks, Carla and Avelka, for having me. Yeah, I'm the founder of Diversity Think Tank and author of the forthcoming book, I Don't Understand, Navigating Unconscious Bias in the Workplace. I'm also the creator of the IDU methodology, which is featured and underpins the book. And essentially, I'm a workplace bias expert. So our focus is to help individuals and organizations be more inclusive and build more inclusive cultures by equipping them with strategies and skills to navigate what I define as the inevitability of unconscious workplace bias. So that's essentially what I do. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that introduction, Buki. And we're so excited to talk a lot more about your book and just delve into a little bit more behind not just the work that you do, but the man behind the think tank. But before then, I'm going to hand over to my co-founder, Avelka. I think she's got something special up her sleeve to get the conversation started today. So do indulge us. Enjoy the ride is all I'm going to say.
I'm stressed.
So the question that I want to ask you really derives from Stephen Bartlett's conversations, and as everyone probably knows, we both Carla and I are inspired by some of the conversations that he has had with a number of inspirational guests. So I thought I'd ask you one of those questions today, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So your question is by Ben Francis, who is the founder of Gymshark. And he asks, why do you do what you do? And I thought this was a brilliant opening question as we delve into this conversation.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. Yeah, big question. Well, look, I think I think we all, I personally think that we all are here for a reason. Yeah, and I feel that part of that reason should be to make the world a better place in whichever way that you can do it. My mother used to always quote the Julia Carney poem, right? And she'd say, little drops make the mighty ocean. That's what she would always say. And I think if we can all do our little bit to make the world a better place, then I think we can make seismic changes in the world for good. So with regards to unconscious bias, I feel that there's an opportunity to manage and navigate that in a way which will help people's careers, and so that's why I do what I do. I want to help people navigate career-stifling unconscious bias in all its forms, in every way it shows itself within the workplace.
Oh, wow.
I love that that's such an amazing start to the conversation, and it leads so well, I think, already into my first question. For those that might be visiting our platform, say for the first time, or they're just kind of really getting onto the kind of like the step ladder of the world or the spectrum that is, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Could you explain to us your understanding of what is unconscious bias? And beyond that, not just what it is by definition, what has been your experience of that it's really kind of driven why you do what you do?
Yeah. So look, I think that's a really good question, because there are so many different views and definitions that people have of unconscious bias, and so I'm glad you asked it, because I see unconscious bias in particular in the workplace as unconscious career stifling behaviors aimed towards particular groups. That's what tending, typically minority and marginalized groups, right? So that could be based on ethnicity, based on gender identity, race, all of the age, socioeconomic background. When you are basically treated unfairly, unconsciously, as a result of conditioned negative stereotypes that people are unaware of, but they hold these conditioned views of certain groups, in particular minorities. So that's my definition, if you like, of unconscious bias. But there's another side to unconscious bias, which people don't always talk about, and that is unconscious bias is also any negative conditioned view of a majority, right, as well. So it's not just views, conditioned views of a minority which influence the way that you behave and make decisions towards that minority or marginalized group. It's also any conditioned view of a majority held by a minority, or held by another member of the majority. Yeah, any conditioned view that influences your thinking and behavior towards that group. So I think that's a more holistic definition of it. The problem is we tend to look at it from one perspective, what I call a unidirectional approach, one direction in terms of career stifling unconscious bias. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that we make. So I'm kind of getting into what I talk about in my book, but I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that we make.
And what would you say? Obviously, getting into something like unconscious bias it's not an easy feat, and I think this also ties in quite well with maybe Evelka's question earlier on. And we're going to go back to I think connecting your definitions of unconscious bias, but also in terms of why unconscious bias has been such a focus for you. And I imagine, and this kind of leads into the second part of my question, what has been your experience of that it's kind of motivated you into this space that you clearly are so passionate about championing?
Yeah, well, I think, it's a great, again, another great question. I should actually first of all, I think it's important in your first question, I should give some examples of unconscious bias and how it manifests in the workplace, and which leads into why I got into this. So sometimes, for example, there are, and you could say that this is a bias in and of itself, but there are widely held views about women in senior roles, and you can see this in organizations, right? In this country, I think there's 51% women. I don't know the exact number at the moment, but something around that, 51 or 50.5%, when definitely in the States, the 50.5% of the population are female. Yet in the Fortune 500, right, I think there are only 8% of the 8.8% of the Fortune 500 has female CEOs running these companies, right? That's ridiculous. This is because of conditioned views about women in senior roles, right? Women aren't seen as management or leadership material or CEO material, and so they never get to the position. They never have the equal opportunity to get to those positions where they can be seen as potentially CEOs. So that would be a form of unconscious bias, gender bias, right? Again, you could look at ethnic minorities, and let me talk about Black people because I'm a Black person, right? So I can talk about that with authority. Sometimes Black men, Black people in general, but let me talk about men, and then we can get into intersectionality. So let me just talk about as a Black male, right? Sometimes Black men are perceived as unserious, or are perceived as aggressive, or are perceived as party tricks, or jokers, or people who aren't serious about their careers, right? This is a conditioned view from a narrative which has happened over decades, right? And as a result, the majority unconsciously sees them in that way. So when you're in an organization and there's opportunity for promotion or for senior roles, it affects the way people make decisions. So they may not see you as management material, or they may not see you as a person they want on the glamorous project or in a client-facing role. And it's not because they consciously think that or believe that. It's an unconscious thinking pattern which influences their behavior and leaves the minority in this case, and marginalized group in this case, as as a victim of their bias, and puts them in a position where their opportunities aren't as equal career progression. And you could say the same with people with disabilities. When was the last time you saw a CEO of a major organization who was a person with physical disability? Very rare. It's very rare. So these are all examples of how unconscious bias manifests itself in the workplace. And I'm talking specifically about in the workplace. So you could talk about recruitment and all those other things, but I'm talking about when you're in. So these are all examples. And to answer the other side of your question, personally, I used to, when I was working for other people, now I run my businesses, when I was working for other people, other organizations, I used to sense bias towards me. I sensed a lot of bias, towards me. And I felt it was unfair, and I felt there was nothing I could do about it, and I felt it affected my career opportunities and my progression. I was in sales, so I was successful anyway. But at times, I felt that depending on the organization I was working for, I would have to deal with things because of conditioned views, negative stereotypes about Black men, right? And when you have to deal with these things, it affects your well-being and your confidence levels, your ability to talk, you self-censor, and all of these things impact your career, your ability to be seen, your ability to get yourself in a position to be seen as senior leadership material. So this is how I got into this, right? But the other side of this was that sometimes I would sense bias, and I would sense it incorrectly. And the reason I would sense it incorrectly was because of my conditioned view of the majority, because of what had happened to me before, and what was a kind of hearsay in my community, and a wider narrative about the majority. So then I would misinterpret perfectly normal behavior towards me as driven by unconscious bias, when actually that was my bias. Right?
So true.
So I started getting frustrated, because sometimes bias, right? And I realized I was wrong, and I go, oh, whoops, I got that one wrong, right? Right in my head, I thought, oh my gosh, I got that wrong, and this happened. And then when I left when I started working for myself and founded my own business as a consultant in the city and globally, I would also sense bias towards me in terms of getting deals, right? And the problem is sometimes I was right. There was bias towards me, right? And I wasn't given in the embryonic days of my business. But a lot of the time I was incorrect. Sometimes I was wrong. Sometimes I would sense bias because maybe there was a delay and I thought it was kind of weird, or the people didn't say, I love you, Buki, come and work for me, give me a hug, So that was my own insecurities, right? And so I would sense bias, right? And then maybe I would forget about the client. Then maybe 5 months later, 5 weeks later, I get a call saying you've got the business. And then I think, oh my God, I got that wrong. And that's why I realized that this was my bias, right? I decided I've got to find a way of working this out, or otherwise I'm going to go crazy, right? And that led me on the road to find out how to navigate what I've come to realize is the inevitability of unconscious bias in the workplace. And what I believe is the multi-directional nature of it. So.
I was just about to say, you raise so poignant, all these element aspects are that all at play at the same time, intertwining, simultaneous, reactionary to one thing, one element to another within. It's almost like this massive ball that is unconscious bias. And I think just listening to just the layers that you've described of its complexity, my first thing that comes to mind is like, how do we stop the madness? It's like a terribly vicious circle and cycle. How do we do that? I know this is what you have dedicated your life's work to challenging. What is your kind of advice speaking into that? And is this why I don't understand your upcoming book came into being?
Yeah, that's how I came up with the title, because I really didn't understand. Right? But the interesting thing is that I didn't think I came to the conclusion that most people don't understand. They don't really understand. It's so interesting that you said stop the madness, because I used to have a talk, because I'm a speaker, and I used to have a talk, and it was called Stop the Madness, right? It's called Stop the Madness, Navigating Unconscious Bias in the Workplace. That's what it was called, because it can drive you crazy. And I think the biggest mistake that most people make, and I touched on this earlier, is they look at unconscious bias as unidirectional. So they subscribe to what I describe as a guilty perpetrator versus hapless victim model, right? Whenever you look at unconscious bias as unidirectional, that is coming from one direction, right? You subscribe to that guilty perpetrator versus hapless victim model, because basically you're saying that there are these people who look a certain way, walk a certain way, talk a certain way. They are the guilty perpetrators. And then there are these people who look a certain way, walk and talk a certain way. They are the hapless victim, right? But the problem with that is when you subscribe to that, right? And majority leaders, a lot of majority leaders and corporate organizations subscribe to this model. When you subscribe to that as a majority leader, right, what you're doing is reconditioning yourself as a guilty perpetrator, and you're sending the message to the minority that you're guilty. So, you work on interrupting your biases and clearing your, and trying to be less, trying to get rid of your implicit bias. But in the process, you're sending the message to the minority, marginalized group, that I'm guilty. All right. So they will look at you as a guilty perpetrator. So that's the first problem with that. The second problem with that is that if you're guilty, there must be a victim of your guilt. There must be you must have perpetrated your guilty behavior to someone, right? Well, who is that? There must be a victim of your behavior. Well, that hapless victim has to be the minority, right? So now we're seeing minorities as hapless victims, right? Which is a bias in and of itself, right? That they need you to change in order for them to progress. And so you actually condition the minority to think that. So now the minority looks at you as a guilty perpetrator and feels that they are reliant on you to change in order for them to have a successful career, to progress their careers successfully. So I realized that this is wrong. I thought it's just not the right model, right? For a couple of reasons, right? Already I've given you examples of my bias, right? So I'm the typical victim, right? Traditional victim, minority, marginalized group. But I've shown you how I could be biased to the majority. So obviously there are two forms of bias, right? So bias is multidirectional. It's not unidirectional, right? So the first thing that we need to do if we want to address the issue of unconscious bias, right, is to recognize that it's multidirectional. I can be biased as much as another person can be biased, as much as a majority member can be biased. Historically and typically, people like me in marginalized groups, us in marginalized groups and minorities, have got the worst of it. But that doesn't change the fact that there is I can misinterpret perfectly normal behaviors as driven by unconscious bias when they're not. That would be my bias.
And I definitely think that there is a case specifically from minoritized and marginalized groups where they think it's only directed towards them, but that attitude and thinking is actually their bias being manifested through those relations and those interactions. And I think there is a trick that is missed by thinking in that unidimensional approach. But I guess my question would be, is then training of unconscious bias or around unconscious bias within the workplace, is that fit for purpose from what you've seen and what you've experienced?
I think it's not. I think it's not. First of all, if you have a unidirectional approach to it, if you have this one-way approach to it, the other bad news about that is that if it's one way, right, you take the minority out of the equation. So they have no say-so. They just sit on their hands and wait and hope that you're empathetic and you feel good, and then their world will be good. So that's wrong, right? So you're actually you're disempowering the already disempowered further. So in terms of training, it doesn't, traditional unconscious bias training doesn't actually work for those reasons, right? In fact, if you look at traditional, I'll give you an example of traditional, very quick example of traditional unconscious bias training. So this is kind of like a summation. What happens is that they'll say, right, we all have biases, right? We all have, think of a pilot, close your eyes, think of a pilot. What do you see? And typically you come up with they say it's probably a white male, right? And you don't think of a black person, you don't think of a female or a black female, right? So that's your bias. It doesn't mean you're racist, it doesn't mean you're misogynistic, it just means that you have biases. We all have biases. And then what happens? They say, right, so let's try and improve, let's try and change, right? So then what happens is they say, right, okay, let's talk to all the majority and tell them how they should be nice to people of color. And that's basically it. They don't talk to the minority about the potential that they have bias as well. Yet you say we all have biases. So I think traditional unconscious bias training in the workplace, I don't think it's fit for purpose because one, it doesn't recognize the multidirectional nature. And when you don't recognize the multidirectional nature, the other problem is that it narrows, it limits the solutions that you come up with. But if you do recognize the multidirectional nature, suddenly you're in a different world. Because if I recognize the multidirectional nature, what happens is that when I sense bias, I know that could be my bias. I know I could be misinterpreting what's happening. So if I'm misinterpreting, if I know that, I will always allow for that. So suddenly me allowing for my misinterpretation, it reduces my stress level because I immediately think, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe so it reduces my stress level, and I can then look to try and establish, am I on the receiving end of bias or not, right? And the way that we do that, or we suggest that you do that, is to simply say, I don't understand. That's it. It's the simplest and most unscathed place you can come from. We call that dispassionate developmental inquiry. Just tell the person you don't understand. You turn it into a question, say, I don't understand, like that, I don't understand. And what you're going to find is that you'll invoke a response from the presumed perpetrator. And suddenly you're in a position where you can navigate it. But of course, if you see bias as unidirectional, you'll see it as somebody, you'll think I'm always right when I sense it. And that will put you in a really uncomfortable state because you think this person's being biased towards me. And you won't know how to deal with it. Or at least when you do deal with it, you either flip out, right? Or you look for a safe space to go and have a conversation to somebody about something you imagine is happening, but you're not sure is happening. Or you'll go and tell your friends and family. And who will you tell? Who will your friends and family typically look like? Well, if you're a black male, there's probably going to be other black people. If you're disabled, it's going to be other disabled people. If you're a woman, it's going to be other women. If you're minority sexual orientation, it's going to be somebody that's minority sexual orientation because that's who you're comfortable with. The problem is that just reinforces the bias about the majority when you don't even know whether what you're sensing is actual bias. Does this make sense?
So would unconscious bias be somewhat untranslatable to different to relationships and interactions? Is that kind of the middle, the solution that we're aiming at, that it's not quite this or that, but it's there, and we have to acknowledge that we won't understand? Is that kind of the solution that we're grappling with?
I think we just have to allow for our misinterpretation because it's called implicit bias, right? So the person doesn't know. So how would you know? How would you, if it was obvious, it would be called explicit bias, but it's called implicit bias, right? So basically what we need to do is just allow for our misinterpretation. The key to navigating bias, right, is to allow for your misinterpretation. But the problem is people don't allow for their misinterpretation. They think they're right. And the worst thing is that they don't know how to call out bias. So they don't know what to say. So when you're on the receiving end of bias, you don't know what to say. You can't say you're biased. You didn't give me that job because I don't tick X, Y, and Z box based on your conditioned view of what X, Y, and Z should be. You can't say that. So you don't say anything. So at worst, you call it in. But what the next best thing, the next half-baked solution, is that you tell somebody else. So in terms of the solution, in terms of how to deal with it, right? The first thing is accept that you could misinterpret what you're sensing, but we don't do that. What we tend to do is we bring understandable baggage to the table, right? So you tend to bring 400 years of slavery to the table, but you can't bring, you can't bring the ills of colonial empire to the table. You can't bring the suffragette movement to the table. You can't bring the fact that there's only X amount of women in senior roles to the table. When you sense bias, you have to drop all of that, right? You have to drop all of that. Does that make sense? And when you drop all of that, that allows you to move to the next step. And the next step is to give people the benefit of the doubt. So you can't give somebody the benefit if you got that.
I think what you're talking about is so important. But I think in terms of creating an environment where individuals will feel that they can engage with that process, it sounds to me like a very big trust ask. How do we get people to that space together?
Yes, yeah. I think Shakespeare says, "Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown." Right? I think what we need is leaders to lead. It can be difficult, but I think we need leaders to lead from the front. I think when you look at the way organizations address career stifling unconscious bias, what they tend to do is, if you observe companies, what they tend to do is they tend to focus on the symptoms. The leaders tend to focus on the symptoms of it, right? So, when the whole George Floyd thing happened, right, and everybody was at home and was watching it on TV, the reaction was huge to that. What happened is that you had large corporations then saying, right, oh my God, we treat these people so badly. We need to change. So we're going to hire 50 Black managers, right? That seemed like a nice thing to do, but actually that's focusing on the symptoms. What you want to focus on is the thinking that created the disparity, right? That created the underrepresentation, and change that. Right. So a lot of leaders, in terms of addressing unconscious bias, they focus on the symptoms. And the problem is the traditional victims, staff, minority, marginalized groups, they focus on the causes. So when I sense bias towards me, right, in the moment, I think, trying to hold me down because of my race and ethnicity. Like that's what happens to us, right? But I shouldn't do that. What I should focus on is the short list that I haven't been put on. So I should ask questions around the shortlist. I shouldn't bring my baggage to the table, right? And the actual causes is what the leadership should focus on, and the symptoms is what the actual traditional victim should focus on. But we got it the other way around, right? So leaders have almost like a knee-jerk response, and the minority, the traditional victim, is too busy bringing all this other baggage to the table. And so I think we need to switch it around. So to answer your question, I think, leaders need to lead from the front and talk about the multi-directional nature of bias. And that's the difficult thing, because people don't want to seem unsympathetic to the equality cause. So the minute you say, but you could be biased as well, it's like, right, this is a defensive, fragile majority leader, right? So they have to find a way. But I think the way you do that is to define unconscious bias. If you were to, in fact, forget my definition, if you were just to go into a dictionary, right, and look up unconscious bias, it wouldn't say it wouldn't say discriminative, unaware discriminative behavior to people of marginalized groups. It wouldn't say that. It would say to groups. So I think start with the definition. Start with the definition. And then when you start with the definition, you can then say, well, how does this manifest in the workplace? And it manifests You know, people of marginalized groups and minorities and marginalized groups being at the wrong end more so of unconscious bias. But it also manifests in what I describe as reverse bias, misinterpretations of the majority decisions and behavior as driven by unconscious bias when they're not favorable to the minority or marginalized group. So I think it's about redefining what unconscious bias is. And the way that we do that in the book, I don't want to go on too much, but the way that we do that is to recognize that there are two forms of bias. You know, the first is what I describe as directional bias. That's towards you, typically from a majority to a minority or marginalized group member. But there's also reverse bias. And reverse bias is when you misinterpret unfavorable decisions as driven by unconscious bias. Now, if we can understand that, then we can say, well, how do I deal with bias when I sense it? But you can't say that unless you recognize that there are two forms of bias. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And I certainly
your short question.
I certainly think so.
Yeah, that was you really gave like a really good understanding in terms of the interplay between all of these dynamics, and they're pulling in opposite directions. You know, they're certainly not remedying the issue of trying to create a unity where there is dissonance. And it's just so important, I think, for us to, and I think that might be a tough thing, generally speaking, for people to even consider that is at play, because it will require a level of personal responsibility to come to the table. And from what you've described, it's, if we're going to talk about and acknowledge and accept, as you've said, there is a unidirectional dynamic to what unconscious bias does. If we imagine it to be a vehicle, it's running on unidirectional kind of like engines. And I think if we're going to do that, it will cost everybody that is in that environment to acknowledge, what is my part to play here? What is the part that I'm playing in terms of, like you said, am I willing to accept that I might have misinterpreted something? And I can imagine that is quite a tough bridge for many kind of to cross. Would you not agree, Evelka?
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think even from my own experiences, I'm now rethinking some of the instances when I thought it was bias, but I could possibly be in the shoes of misinterpreting that as well. And I think it's just like really shifting our mindset from the traditional narrative that we've been told and we've been driven by. And I think it's so important for us to deconstruct that, because we're not going to really get anywhere with it. And I think the biggest issue or the hindrance that is causing people not to acknowledge it is they don't want to be vulnerable, and they don't want to be uncomfortable in engaging these, because these are really uncomfortable conversations that leaders have to talk to their employees, their workforce about. How do you step outside of that? And I think it takes a really brave, vulnerable leader that really wants to set what we call sustainable change in order to break that barrier and showcase that, you know, I have bias, but that's a one directional approach. We need to acknowledge that multi-directional approach. It's not me, it's not you, but it's an understanding of looking at it, like you said, from a holistic point of view. That's where real change happens.
I agree, and I think what we need to do is own the problem as humans. You know, we keep leaning into immaterial differences. You know, the fact that I'm a man and you're a woman, that is a difference, right? And it's an important difference, and it's an important difference that should be recognized. And you know, and that's what makes human beings interesting, right? We shouldn't lean into those differences when we're looking at a universal issue, a universal problem. And I think so. We need to own it. We need to own it as human beings, right? Not own it as a majority member or as a minority member. We need to own it as we're human beings first. And one of the reasons why I bang on about this whole multi-directional nature of workplace bias is because if you can accept the multi-directional nature of workplace bias, you're actually just more than accepting that I could misinterpret as a minority So I could be biased. You're actually accepting more than that. You're actually accepting what we all should know anyway, but we forget. When you accept the multidirectional nature of workplace bias, you're actually accepting that we're all the same. We're all the same. So if you're biased, but the minute you don't, the minute when you say, that's why I've got a great sense of humor, but I'm not a big fan of things like pale, male, and stale, and all these, I'm not a fan of these terms. They're funny, and I know what the whole thinking behind it is, but I think they're divisive. I think they're divisive because they put, they drive a wedge between us, right? And this whole bias thing is not a them versus us. It's an us versus us. So what we need to do, right, is recognize the multidirectional nature. And when we do, we're actually recognizing that we're all the same. And suddenly now it becomes easy to handle, right? But if you don't, solutions that you come up with from a unidirectional perspective will take you the wrong road, take you down the wrong road. It's, for example, microaggressions. For those who don't know what a microaggression, these are subtle slights towards minorities and marginalized groups in relation to their differences, and they're unconscious, mostly unconscious, sometimes conscious, but mostly unconscious. So a person could say to me, or at least people used to say to me, and I would used to, especially when I started my business, and I would see it as a microaggression. Oh, you speak so well, right? You speak so well. Right? I would see that as a sort of microaggression. You say, "What do you mean I speak so well?" This was my internal thinking was, "What do you mean? What do you mean I speak so well? I'm a client-facing graduate just like you. Why would you say I speak so well?" So that was how, and I would take offense at it, right? But in reality, the person could just be telling me I speak so well compared to them.
Yes.
So why not just take it as a compliment? Why not just say, "Oh, thank you, so do you"? But no, I would have this thing which would probably be palpable to people, internal dialogue, right? So instead of having that internal dialogue, why not just accept it as a compliment? Give the person the benefit of the doubt, right? But of course, you're not going to come up with that kind of solution. You're not going to come up with that if you're wedged into this idea that bias is unidirectional and people like you are at the wrong end of it. You can't allow for that. So then, when I used to respond negatively to that type of compliment, that was my reverse microaggression. Because in some cases they just thought I spoke so well. How would I? Why? And the same thing when people ask you, "Where are you from?" And this is a big one.
I was going to say about that from my own personal experience. I actually love it when people ask me that. I genuinely love it. I'm just like, well, I'm from the Caribbean. This is my Caribbean heritage. But
people regret asking me because I just throw up all over them. I mean, I really get into it. I give them my mom, my dad, the whole family tree. But some people see that as offensive, right? And I'm saying, well, unless you've got a choice.
Yeah.
You can see it as offensive, or just respond. Just tell them where you're from. Assume that the person's interested. Assume that the person's coming from a nice place. If the person says it in a nasty, in what you perceive to be a nasty way, there are ways of dealing with that. We show how to deal with that in the moment. But again, a lot of the time, if we use that Ngozi Fulani case in the palace, I would argue, some people would disagree with me, but I would argue that sometimes we're carrying our baggage into the situation, and it's just waiting for someone to just say something or the wrong thing, and then we're all over them. And so that's why I think actually we need to teach people how to deal with sensed bias. And the first rule in learning how to deal with sensed bias is allowing for your misinterpretation. Because when you allow for your misinterpretation, you won't be on the offensive. You'll kind of want to inquire, to check. And the best way to check is to simply say, "I don't understand." Turn that statement into a question. I'm going into teaching mode, but I can't help it.
That's totally fine. You're absolutely amongst good company here, because these are the things that get us really excited of delving into it. I was just reflecting on how recently I attended a form of training as well on microaggressions, and not once did I see any discussion at all about the potential of, can we accept that at times this could be misinterpreted. And I think it's interesting that you raise the examples that you did with regards to people ask me, where are you from? And I think when I listen to many other narratives, that they're just so vastly different. For example, so people ask me about the texture of my hair, and I've many a time, and I share this fondly, particularly like, you know, little older ladies in the community that have they genuinely just don't know. And I'm like, yeah, please have a feel. I'm not used to it. I'm happy to be someone who you're willing to engage with, because if they really were quite nasty, you wouldn't come into my space. If you really weren't inquisitive, you wouldn't be. And I think, like, you're right, is there a way, almost like a litmus pickup, from which intent is it malicious, and in which intent is this genuine interest of people trying to reach and make connection? And I think people have to be, I think, of the mindset and of the internal you know, approach already, that am I going to be open to be a connector, or am I already looking because I want to maintain my disconnect and be contented with the position that I'm occupying that has already put me kind of separate, or I'm already alienated, if that makes sense. And I struggle with that one, if I'm very honest, because that's certainly, I think, collectively amongst us three individuals here, we are speaking off the same hymn sheet, whether we are kindred spirits on our aspirations and approach, that this is very doable. And this is definitely, if everybody was to grab hold and champion of this approach, we would see sustainable change. But I think my question is there a way, or how do we navigate trying to bridge that for everyone, or at least balance somewhere? And I imagine people, we cannot disregard people's genuine experience. And that is what, and I think somebody else mentioned this before, what is the story that we're telling us in ourselves, or the story we're telling ourselves, or the story that we are living by? And usually that is based on very real experiences. We cannot disregard that. But how do we overcome that, just still make the connection, rather than continue the victimization, or to continue the dissonance, or to continue the alienation from one another? That would be my question. Is there a balance we can find?
Yeah, well, here's what, and you know, again, what I talk in my book, I talk about what I call our internal GPS, right? We have an internal GPS, right? And I call this the peeve or leave system. And how I came about this, right, is that I got to a point where I was sensing bias, and I felt I should say something. But then I was thinking, but what if I'm wrong? Or is it worth me saying something? Or I became so good at I became the bias king. I was so good at kind of sensing bias, the reasons why, you know, psychoanalyze people in like 5 seconds. This person thinks this because of X, Y, and it was driving me crazy, right? So I thought I had to come up with a system, like, so that I could get on with my career, right? So the system I came up with was, right, whenever you're in a situation, you need to ask yourself, you need to determine what type of situation you're in, right? And these things happen in moments, right? And you need to determine how to respond. So I came up with this. Is this an LTFU moment? Or is this a YSPMO moment? So LTFU stands for lighten the fudge up, right? Is this a lighten the fudge up moment, right? Right? Or where I'm just going to leave it alone, just let it go. Or is this you're so peeving me off moment, right? That is, I need to have a more extended conversation with someone, because what's happened is really, you know, career stifling, right? Or annoying, right? Or I felt was holding me back. So I translated that into a system, which I call peeve or leave. So whenever I'm confronted with what I sense to be some form of bias, be it a microaggression, or be it something more complex, like some kind of career stifling behavior, which I can't put my finger on, but I know it's stifling my career, and it comes from a negative conditioned views. I always ask myself, is this a peeve or leave moment, right? And so if a person says to me, well, they don't. They say, can I touch your hair, right? In the example that you gave. No, I don't have any hair to touch, right? But but in my workshops, I say to people, ask yourself, is that a peeve or lead? Right? If it's a lead, and this is a personal thing. This is the other thing about these kind of microaggression and type. They kind of generalize, but it's down to the individual. If you see it as a peeve situation, then you need to have an extended conversation with that person. Now, we can talk about how you do that in a second, right? But if you see it as a leave situation, then you just need to bat it away. You can say either not, so somebody might say to me, can I touch your hair? I might say, only if you allow me to rummage my hands through your hair first. And that person's probably going to laugh or whatever, or not. But the bottom line is, I've made a point and I've moved on and I can enjoy my lunch. And what I don't want to do is go, that person asked me, can I, internal dialogue. Person asked me, can I touch my hair? What do they mean by that? What are they trying to say? Because all that does is make you feel not good, right? So what you want to do is just try and bat it away. Or you could let them. You could say, sure, touch my, whatever, But I think we need these tools to deal with these situations. So I've got this exercise which I do, and I call it peeve or leave, and that's it. And so if it's a peeve situation, then I need to have a conversation. I need to have an IDU, and I don't understand conversation, and that's where I need to engage in dispassionate developmental inquiry with the person, and have a conversation about what they've said to me, recognizing that I could misinterpret it. But I think the first thing is, for everyday microaggressions, we need to check ourselves. We need to say, is this worth, and this is how I do it, right? Is this worth ruining my lunch over? That's my leveler, right? So lunch, or am I going to get into some negative internal dialogue or get annoyed with this person? And so a person said to me, you speak so well, that's not worth ruining my lunch over. So if a person says to me, you speak so well, I say, you speak so, thanks, you speak so well too. Or I might say, oh, thanks. And I say, no, thanks, don't sound so surprised. And then move on and enjoy your lunch. Don't have to go say, don't sound so surprised, and then wait to see what the other person says, and then get into a dialogue. Just move on and enjoy your lunch. So that would be my tactic. But if I feel haven't been shortlisted for a senior management role, and I feel that everything I've done suggests that I should be, then I need a conversation. So I'm going to say, I really don't understand what the criteria. I'm really just for my own development. Could you just tell me what the criteria was for that for the shortlist? Now we're into a conversation. So this is dispassionate developmental inquiry. So that, to answer your question, that allows you to find the balance. But you'll notice here, I'm a traditional victim, but I'm leading it. I'm leading the dialogue. But of course, if you come from a unidirectional perspective, right, there's no space for me to do that.
Yeah.
Somebody else has to change, which leaves me as a hapless victim and leaves that person as a guilty perpetrator, which is what too many of these unconscious bias trainings and initiatives are subscribed to.
Yeah,
certainly.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. You have, I think, bullseyed so many of our questions that we came in with today. And I think there's so much food for thought. There's such important food for thought. And I think it's just so refreshing to hear a very balanced perspective of other considerations in terms of the journey forward with unconscious bias and the voice that you're bringing to that overt conversation. I would say, Ivalka, do you have any final questions or pointers for Buki?
No, I was going to say no, but I've just thought of one. But my last question would be, what was in a sentence, what was one of the key learnings that you've had throughout this process in delving into investigating, exploring the world of unconscious bias?
Okay, so I think that's key learnings. That's true. Well, one is obviously I've been getting the multi-directional nature of it. I think that's the key. But I think the other thing is that if I were to put it into a nutshell, right, the way to navigate sensed, career-stifling unconscious bias, right, is to call it out in the moment. When you sense it, you must call it out. And as a victim, you must call it out. But as a traditional perpetrator, you must call it out. So if you sense my bias, if you are a majority member and you sense my bias towards you, you need to, in a sense, say, I don't understand. You need to call me out. And the way to call people out is to engage in dispassionate developmental inquiry. So I think in terms of navigating bias, right? In terms of navigating career stifling bias, we need to call it out. So I think that's the key. We need to call it out. But the problem is nobody knew how to call it out. So I'm going to give the whole world a pass, right? Until now.
Amazing. No, thank you for that.
Until now, because now you can engage in what we call DDE, dispassionate developmental inquiry, and people should be able to. So if you sense my bias as a majority person, you should call me out, and if I sense your bias, I should call you out, right, in a way which doesn't invoke fragility, what we describe as defensive fragility. And if you call me out and I call you out, we'll neutralize the problem. And the problem will dissipate over time. And it will be like, I have hay fever. Do you have hay fever? Do you get hay fever?
Sometimes. The last few summers have been kind to me, let's put it that way. It's no joke when it comes.
All the time for me.
It's up and down with me, but now I've got it, right? But I take antihistamines, right? And that gets rid of it, right? So I don't understand. IDU is the antihistamine, is the antidote, for navigating career stifling bias. I would say if we can call it out by leveraging this I don't understand, right? What we're going to find is that it will no longer be a major issue for us.
Yeah.
So there's my answer.
Okay, that was just incredible. And I think that was a great question to kind of end off on. But within all of this conversation, I think just having the opportunity to reflect has been, I think, so enriching just for us. And I know that all of our listeners will feel exactly the same when they come across this podcast. Buki, we're so excited for you. We believe that your book is up and coming later this year. Details for the work that Buki does, connecting with him, we have links to all of those provided in the caption below. So make sure that you watch, listen, and follow those links through to connect with Buki Mosaku. Buki, once again, a huge thank you for joining our platform here at Connecting Conversations. It's been an honor. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.